What's up YouTube, Capital G here, talking floodgates in this video and how if you're not running one of the dominant pendulum based decks in the game right now, I think that you should definitely look at running some of these cards, or at the very least siding them. You're probably siding them already, but a lot of these cards are definitely noteworthy, like straight up in the main deck. Now we all know that Performages and Pals is, well, I argue that it's the strongest deck right now, and I think that it does have a target on its back because, you know, it can make a lot of advantage turn one. It's very explosive. It can blow its own pendulum skills up to get more cards to pendulum summon, etc., etc. But a lot of these cards can just either be really effective against that deck in particular, or a lot of pendulum decks, or just a lot of the meta. So I want to talk about these cards individually and then talk about, you know, some of the decks that you can run this in, because I feel like there really isn't a deck that's like tier 1 to even maybe like tier 2.5 that can't run some of these again. But this isn't really this isn't intended if you run Performages and Pals for you to run these cards necessarily. The first card is lose one turn. I remember thinking that this was going to be essentially a major replacement for, you know, Cleafort when they lost like Vanities, Emptiness, and Skill Drain. They lost a couple of copies of each one of those cards, and for a little while until Konami decided that Cleafort were just not going to be a deck anymore, it really was. Cleafort were essentially able to still pendulum their cards, and then at the same time they could make their pushes with tribute summon cards that were unaffected by lose one turn, and then they could trigger their like helixes and carriers because they were tributed. This card is really good against your Performapal decks and kind of like anything that's pendulum, because even though you don't necessarily get to stop the pendulum summon, the monsters that they summon are really not a threat. And considering that pendulum summoning a lot this format has been kind of an accelerant for just mass Xyz summons or sometimes synchro summons, even those monsters aren't going to get their effects. They come out in defense mode, their most vulnerable position, and they can attack obviously. And there used to be a good workaround this with Exciton Knight and Book of Moon, but now that Exciton is banned, this card is even much better. I like the only real out to it that your opponent can do with a monster that comes out of the extra deck that turn is, I guess they could kind of do the same thing with like a Diamond Direwolf plus a Book of Moon, but it's nowhere near as good as the Exciton play, and no one really plays Book of Moon this format anyways. I would recommend this in probably anything that runs, like I would consider this in decks like Yosenju. Obviously it's been kind of a staple in that, and then in sideframes, because when you play sideframes, a lot of times you're summoning during your opponent's turn, and even when you get an Omega out, the Omega does have to come out in defense mode. But I mean, I believe Omega has like 2400 defense, so it's really hard to run him over. And I mean, once it comes back to your turn, you can just put him in attack mode, start activating his effect over and over again. Next card up is Robbery of Warlords. I love this card a lot. This card is really fantastic, and it actually, I was kind of feeling stupid because I can't believe I had forgot about this. Robbery of Warlords is really good against these decks that are kind of a culmination of a bunch of little archetypes. One of the biggest one obviously right now is Performages and Pals. You know, it's a mix of, you know, Performages, and you've got like a whole bunch of other random spellcasters. You've got Gigabyte and all that stuff. The thing about this is, even though Yu-Gi-Oh is an archetype-based game where Boojins are all Beast Warriors, and, you know, a deck like Sertella Knights are all Warriors, you wouldn't think that it's effective. But when you have a deck like Performages and Pals where some of the deck is Reptile and some of the deck is, you know, Spellcaster, and then your opponent can potentially play things like Gem Knight Fusion and Instant Fusion, where you could chain this to that and they'd be locked under like Fairy or, you know, some other random shit that they can't play. This card essentially stops them from being able to make any extra deck plays. You can actually use it against Burning Abyss too, because all the Burning Abyss monsters are they're actually fiends, and then Dante of course is a warrior. So if you're locked in the warrior, excuse me, if you're locked in the fiends, you can't overlay for a warrior. Same exact concept. Get your opponent when they have a spellcaster or a plush fire or something, and then like the only extra deck play that they can really make is something like Trapeze Magician. But even when they can make extra deck plays, they're not very optimal. You can play this in a deck like Sertella Knights. You can actually play this in Magispectors. You can play this in sideframes. The card it's really solid. It's just essentially to lock down your opponent's extra. And again, if you happen to hit this, if you happen to chain this to an Instant Fusion or a Gem Knight Fusion, you're really golden, because a lot of times they won't be able to make any more plays. And actually, if I could be mistaken about this, I believe you can play this in Cosmo effectively because all of your Jedi are psychics, but essentially you banish those to summon machines. So at the time, like let's say you have Farm Girl, you activate her effect, you banish her, she's no longer on the field, so you're not locked into psychics anymore, and then you summon a Dart Destroyer, now you're locked into machines. So the play should work. Next up is Kaiser Colosseum. This supports Cosmos really well, and you saw this kind of played in the in formats where Boojins are really strong. You could just get a Yamato on the field, you just put a whole bunch of armor with like turtle and hair in the graveyard and search cranes and whatnot, and then maybe go into Susanoo, and your opponent would never be able to essentially make any extra deck plays. This is really good in Cosmo right now because if you get a Dart Destroyer out or a Forerunner, your opponent just has to jump through hoops. And even when they finally kill that monster, you know, they special summon monsters themselves too, so your opponent can never ever go into their extra deck. They can never get two monsters on the field, and then you have this huge untargetable monster that's also, you know, a 3,000 beater. Like, this card puts pressure on them. I don't think I would, like, if I was running Cosmos right now, this would be an automatic staple. I mean, you stop any extra deck plays against every deck in the meta. You also stop the Pendulum Summon. Well, your opponent can Pendulum Summon one, but that's not doing anything. Even when your opponent has Recruiters, all you have to do is just constantly attack. And if you have Forerunner, you just gain 1,000 light points every single turn. I would highly recommend this. The only deck I think I can recommend this in is probably Cosmos, though. Next up is AntiSpell Dankness or AntiSpell Fragrance. I love this card a lot. I used to play this in Serteller Knights earlier this year against Necros. Essentially, you just wanted to make sure that they couldn't ritual summon the turn that they wanted to. If your opponent even opened with the Madra or Sanju, didn't matter. They had to set this. And then even if this was active and they drew Mystical Space Typhoon, when it came back to your turn, they still couldn't MST you. They would have to wait to MST you on your turn. This works exceptionally well against any Pendulum deck, as your opponent will not have access to Pendulum monster effects or the Pendulum summon mechanic at all, because we know that Pendulum cards cannot be set face down in the Pendulum zones. But for that reason alone, this card is already good. Like, you can play this against Magic Specters, you can play this against what's it called, Pendulum Magicians, you can play this against Performages and Pals, and they just won't be able to use the Pendulum mechanic at all. I recommend this in Burning Abyss and Serteller Knights. With Serteller Knights, it's really good because you don't have a deck that relies on spell that much, but essentially what you want to do is make Trevor. You want to bounce everything back to the hand, and then you've kind of won the game at that point, because a lot of times if your opponent would set those cards, you know, not the Pendulums, but the regular spell cards that they want to use, the Instant Fusion, Gem Knight Fusion, etc., maybe Upstart Goblin, when it comes around, you flip this over during their draw phase, they have to wait 2 more turns to activate any of those spells, which in Yu-Gi-Oh! 2 turns is like an eternity. I mean, if you're playing against Necros, luckily, I mean, they're just never going to ritual summon. And then in Burning Abyss, you kind of play it for a similar reason, but your execution is a little differently. Mainly, you're trying to Fire Lake their back row. Don't even worry about their monsters for the most part. Unless they make a monster that threatens this card directly, like Diamond Direwolf for Castel, just Fire Lake and just completely wipe out their back row, because a lot of times they're playing spells, they're not chainable, and you just hit resources for free. And again, the entire time they're not able to Pendulum Summon. Then we have Vanities Fiend. I've actually been surprised how effective this card has been coming out of some side decks, and I think that's because really, if you look at a lot of decks that are topping, Regeki has been kind of hit and miss this format. About half of people are playing Regeki. In my Teller Knights, I don't even main deck, I actually side deck it, because, you know, there's a lot of decks that float and it's not necessarily good against spaceships and whatnot. But this card is actually really, really strong right now, and against Performages and Pals, a lot of their monsters are monsters that replace themselves in battle. Cards like, you know, Plush Fire or Trick Clown. If you attack a face down Trick Clown, it'll come back. So if you can get Vanities on board, obviously you're stopping extra in Pendulums, but you're also stopping the other special summon spells, Gem Knight Fusion, Brilliant Fusion. You know, even a deck like Cosmos, if they're not playing Honest, they'll struggle to get over this if they don't have a good Witch. I mean, they can sit on Wicked Witch and let you keep ramming them, but they're still taking damage. So it's actually really, really strong. It's really good against like Infernoids, and honestly, there really isn't anything in the meta that Vanities Fiend isn't strong against. Maybe Serteller Knights, but I'd even argue that it's really strong against this deck too. And then the last card is Imperial Iron Wall. This isn't one that hits like any of the Pendulum based decks, but it is really good against Cosmos and Infernoids. You can run this card in pretty much anything. Oh, by the way, I would recommend Vanities Fiend probably in Burning Abyss or anything, I guess, that can incorporate the Monarch Stormforth. I don't think it can run. I don't think you can run this in sideframes. Probably just Burning Abyss. Imperial Iron Wall is really good because it's okay against sideframes. Their monsters won't be banished. They will keep them. They won't be able to use Omega's effect, which is okay, but it's really good against Infernoids because it's kind of like row oppression against that deck if they can't banish anything. The only outset they have for the most part are essentially like Mystical Space Typhoon, Lila. If they play it, it can have a Galaxy Cyclone trapped in their graveyard. They never can resolve it. They can't summon anything. And I think this card is pretty good. It's really easy to run this and pretty much anything. It's also good against Cosmo because if they can't banish, then they essentially can't summon the spaceships unless they're running Reasoning or some way of getting monsters outside, like back from the graveyard or something like that. Now I know that people have made the argument that floodgates aren't necessarily good because, you know, we have back row removal like Mystical Space Typhoon and Archfiend Eccentric, which honestly I find that argument to be laughable. If you look at Yu-Gi-Oh historically, outside of maybe Cold Wave, I would argue that back row removal has never kept floodgates in check, like throughout the entire game. In fact, if you look at the amount of floodgates that have seen the forbidden and limited list, and then you compare it to the amount of back row removal, like it's not even close. I mean, for back row removal, you have, yes, Giant Trunade, Cold Wave, Heavy Storm, Feather Duster, you know, you could say Breaker the Magical Warrior, Mystical Space Typhoon. Those are cards that have hit the ban list, but you compare that to Imperial Order, Royal Oppression, you know, Vanities, Emptiness, Skill Drain, heck, cards like Dimensional Fissure and Macro, like, aren't even that powerful, and they're still limited in the TCG, let alone Soul Drain. I guess Royal Decree is either way. Gen Release or Rituals, that's another floodgate card. So it's like, even in past formats where we've had Mystical Space Typhoon, because the card has been around forever, it's not like it stopped people from playing Skill Drain and Vanities, and it didn't stop people from winning matches by getting those cards. So I see these cards, like every single one of them has a few matchups that you can just absolutely destroy, and they're so easy to fit in the decks. And I feel like if you just get it, you know, early in the game, you can just win. I was playing on stream on Tuesday. I played against Pendulum Magicians with Sertella Knights, and two out of our 3 games, I drew AntiSpell Fragrance in my opening hand. I flipped it over, and he was just like, all right, you win. So the cards are really good. And speaking of the stream, I know people are going to ask in the comment section, Cap, are you streaming tonight? I'm not going to stream tonight, guys. I will stream on Saturday, and I'll stream on Sunday. I'll stream Saturday and Sunday. I'll stream back to back. I'll do 3 streams this week, guys. Don't worry about that. But let me know what you guys think. I'm bringing this video up because I feel like if we're not going to acknowledge floodgate cards, then it is inevitable that Performers and Powers are just going to run all over the meta. I mean, at least with these cards, maybe you can set up turn 1 so that your opponent never gets that Cyber Infinity on board. They never get that Super 6 setup with the Solemn Notices and whatnot. I think these cards are all fantastic. I think they're pretty easy to splash in decks, and I think they're really, really good against Pendulums because a lot of them, they just either don't allow you to do the Pendulum summon mechanic, or they don't allow you to get enough monsters on board where you can exceed. And if you're gonna Pendulum without exceeding, then like you're not really, like, it's not that much of a threat. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you for watching as always.